Good afternoon, everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Bohdan Medwidsky Memorial Lecture. I would like to begin by reminding all of us that the University of Alberta and the Cool Folklore Centre are located on the traditional territory of Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe nations. These are lands now known as part of Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. We respect the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis and Inuit nations. And we acknowledge and thank them for assisting the early Ukrainian pioneers when they arrived and settled in this area. As an introduction to today's lecture, I'd like to ask the question, what is a domovec? For those of you who don't know, the domovec is a house spirit that appears in folklore and legend of almost every Slavic country. He goes by a lot of different names. In Ukraine, the ancestral homeland of Dr. Medwidsky, the domovec was the house guy, the house watcher, or house spirit, you could say. And if you're a Harry Potter fan, you might even think of him as Dobby, a wise, caring person loyal to his values, heritage, and family. Each year that we have hosted this event, I have sat back and smiled as I'm reminded that Dr. Medwidsky was our domovec at the Cool Folklore Centre, a spirited soul who cared about us, his academic family, and guided us through the understanding of our roots and the deep connection we have with the folklore of Ukraine and our new homes in the diaspora. Today, in the spirit of Dr. Medwidsky, we have invited one of his former students, Dr. Mariya Lesiv. She has followed in the footsteps of her mentor to share with us her perspectives on the world today through the lens of folklore. To tell us a little bit more about Dr. Medwidsky and our guest, I'd like to invite Alexander Pankeyev to the front.
Hello everyone and welcome to our third annual Bohdan Medwidsky Memorial Lecture. The annual lecture is a joint initiative of two organizations, the Alberta Society for the Advancement of Ukrainian Studies, of which I have the privilege of serving as the president, and the Peter and Doris School Center for Ukrainian and Canadian Folklore at the University of Alberta. Both organizations established this lecture to celebrate the tremendous achievements and memory of Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky, well-known folklorist, educator, respected community champion, founder of our organizations, friend, and life mentor to many of us. Dr. Medwidsky cherished Ukrainian traditions for future generations of Ukrainians so they could continue to flourish. He wanted others to follow in his footsteps. His lifetime goal was to create a full-fledged folklore program at the University of Alberta, so the Ukrainian tradition would be studied professionally. Last year's and this year's lecturers are proof that his legacy keeps on living. Both Dr. Andriy Nakhachevsky and Dr. Mariya Lesiv are graduates of the folklore program that Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky established. We also have many in this room who live according to Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky testament to collect, preserve, study, and share Ukrainian culture and traditions. But we also need to remember that tradition is very dynamic. Every generation creates new meanings and practices, often borrowing and mixing from the past. Many of us find the direct connection to the topic of this year, really tragic connection, I would say. But even in this context of the war, new traditions continue to form, strive, shaping our identities. So I'm very honored to introduce this year's lecturer. Dr. Mariya Lesiv is an associate professor of folklore and current head of the folklore department at Memorial University. She is the author of The Return of Ancestral Gods, Modern Ukrainian Paganism, and the Alternative Vision of Nation, published by McGill University Press in 2013. Her work on belief and politics, folklore life, diasporic culture, and folk has appeared in numerous journals. Mariya is a respected and also well-known scholar, and she is the recipient of Social Studies and Humanities Research Council of Canadian Insight Development Grant for her fieldwork-based project, Host Region Post-Socialist Diaspora Communities. For me, Dr. Mariya Lesiv is also the connection that I share with Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky. I have some anecdotes that I won't be sharing probably in this room because they need to stay just among us when we discuss how everything was happening. So without no hesitation, I'm transferring the floor to Dr. Mariya Lesiv.
Thank you so much, Larissa and Alexander. I am deeply honored and humbled to be here. I'm one of those numerous individuals whose life and professional trajectory has been significantly shaped by Dr. Medwidsky and his legacy. It is partially, at least partially, Dr. Medwidsky's fault that for the last 13 years, I've had to endure severe snowstorms and bone-chilling Atlantic winds, but I'm not complaining. Before I proceed with the topic of my presentation, I would like to pay tribute to another giant. Dr. Robert Klimash left this world several weeks ago. I remember an encounter with a friend and fellow graduate student at the University of Alberta many years ago. The friend was preparing for her candidacy exams that, of course, came with an extensive amount of reading. She mentioned to me with an air of astonishment in her voice, "It turns out that Nash Klimash is so widely known and cited." Indeed, Nash Klimash was more than only our Klimash, having significantly contributed to the fields of ethnic and diaspora studies more broadly. It is a great professional privilege to be standing on the shoulders of such giants as Drs. Medwidsky and Klimash. I never thought I would develop a professional interest in anger. But які часи, такі й дослідження. As such are the times, such are the studies. And in contrast to Drs. Robert Klimash and Andrei Nachevsky, who delivered the first two Bohdan Medwidsky Memorial Annual Lectures focusing on complex cultural trajectories in Ukrainian-Canadian contexts, these traumatic times forced me to bring voices from Ukraine, not those from the diaspora, to your attention. While this work began as my own project, it eventually developed into a collaborative study with my American colleague, Robert Glenn Howard, in which, in the form of a dialogue, we examine vernacular responses to the Ukrainian war folklore of violence and anger on the internet from both American and Ukrainian perspectives. While I am presenting my portion of this work and taking it in a slightly different theoretical direction today, this collaboration has shaped many of my ideas, and both Dr. Howard and I have benefited from the publication process that has already started. Even though we explore two different perspectives, we share the same approach. We contextualize the folklore of anger and violence beyond its immediate content and form, drawing on anthropologist Elżbieta Draszkiewicz's call for studying problematic creative expressions, I quote, with compassion, end of quote. Draszkiewicz focuses specifically on conspiracy theories, but her ideas can be applied to other problematic genres. Her approach implies understanding not only the situations of precarity in which some conspiracy theories thrive, but also taking into account specific trajectories of events that led to such situations. Studying with compassion partially resonates with Ukrainian anthropologist Yulia Buiskyk's recent call for, I quote, an anthropology with empathy, end of quote, that prioritizes the experiential perspectives of the insiders of Ukrainian realities, and in that respect resonates with the core foundation of folklore studies. I am, of course, not professionally equipped to convey the perspectives of all Ukrainians. I can only identify distinct patterns, distinct and persistent patterns, and it is one of these patterns that this talk focuses on. I examine from a folkloristic perspective the growing amount of creative responses on online platforms to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Over the last couple of decades, the field of folkloristics has expanded its scope to embrace digitally expressed creativity and its communicative dynamics. Here are just a few examples. This disciplinary shift has also expanded our understanding of the vernacular. While vernacular culture is conventionally associated with the creativity of everyday life, in particular physical locales, the internet has become a new platform for daily communication. Thus, many folklorists have shifted their focus to what Robert Glenn Howard calls the vernacular web, a conceptual framework that allows scholars to study bottom-line online discourses that are often intertwined with institutional information and knowledge. Studying memes and other forms of digital art is a comfort zone for many folklorists today. I'm going to show you a few images that many in this audience will be familiar with and that folklorists are very well equipped to analyze. I found this one particularly interesting because I'm sure many of you remember a story that came from Kiev about a woman who shot a Russian drone with a can of pickles. And then I remember encountering a related meme that said, "Stop fake, it was not pickles, it was a can of tomatoes." But Russia's war against Ukraine has resulted in numerous other creative expressions on the vernacular web, many of which are politically, culturally, and/or emotionally sensitive. Although presented in the form of personal comments, they frequently display distinct recurrent narrative motifs characteristic for traditional oral genres. To folklorists, identifying such motifs may resonate with traditional motif spotting in film and television, a methodology that Michael Coven critiques for its overemphasis on the form. However, as I combine this with Sandra Stahl's approach to personal narratives as expressions that often convey a great degree of traditionality and collective attitudes, motif spotting helps to uncover complex contextual meanings behind war-related commentary, meanings that are immediately recognizable to insiders of the culture. Many distinct narratives that emerged from social media posts after February 24, 2022 are imparted with a folklore of anger shaped by traditional curses. For example, "Росіяни, будьте ви всі прокляті." Russians, may you all be cursed, was a phrase, multiple variations of which appeared on Facebook following the initial attack. Other examples included "Росіяни, виродки прокляті, горіти вам у пеклі." Russians, ugly bastards, may you all burn in hell. Or "Росіяни, будьте прокляті до 7-го коліна." Russians, may you all be cursed for 7 generations. Hostile remarks of this kind not only circulated in vernacular settings, but also entered other cultural spheres such as creative writing. For example, Olena Styashkina, a known Ukrainian historian, journalist, and writer, most of her creative writing prior to the full-scale war had been in Russian, puts it in the following way in Ukrainian. Зараз я погано пишу і коротко думаю. Сили та розуму вистачає на 2-3 речення, таких, щоб злітали, таких, щоб метафора і емоція. Добре виходить тільки оце, щоб вони повиздихали в муках. Now I write poorly and think briefly. I have only enough strength and brain power for 2 or 3 sentences. The types of sentences that soar are full of metaphor and emotion, but the only phrase that turns out well is this: may they die like dogs and suffer in agony. Angry creative references are often directed not only toward the ruling Kremlin regime and the Russian armed forces, but toward nearly all Russians. This attitude is especially reflected in the notion of good Russians, which refers to the liberal-minded citizens of Russia who oppose the Putin regime. Good Russians is a folk narrative motif that has penetrated all strata of Ukrainian society, including vernacular settings, institutional venues, and media outlets. And the following 4 slides are just a few examples showing how persistent this motif is in the media. Occasionally, the concept of good Russians is applied in a literal way, referring to Russian dissidents who have a long-established record of opposition to the Putin regime. However, despite these rare examples, the term has become imparted with a heavy sarcastic connotation and is most frequently used in a derogatory manner. The most radical version is reflected in the widely circulating motif, «Хороший росіянин – це мертвий росіянин». A good Russian is a dead Russian. The following narrative conveys some of these sentiments. «Я тепер ненавиджу російську мову. Уся російська культура є смертоносною. Приєднуйтесь і донатьте на ЗСУ, щоб не було жодного дня без хорошого росіянина». I now hate the Russian language. The entire Russian culture is homicidal. Join us and donate to support the armed forces of Ukraine. We should not have a single day without a good Russian. Many Western outsiders may find such overgeneralized cultural expressions to be deeply immoral, unethical, and overall disturbing. They may wonder why many Ukrainians refuse to appreciate Russian individuals who oppose the Putin regime and the war. These uncomfortable feelings may be partially related to the fact that anger and outrage are diametrically opposite to tolerance, positivity, and niceness that are viewed as social cultural virtues by many in Western societies. Moreover, the Ukrainian war folklore of anger could be interpreted as hate speech as defined by the United Nations. In particular, hate speech is, and I quote, understood as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are, end of quote. Individual Ukrainians frequently report on social media platforms that their posts and entire accounts containing such language of anger have been blocked. This is an indicator that angry folklore is indeed often interpreted as hate speech. Some Ukrainian journalists and activists have documented and analyzed numerous instances of posts and entire accounts that have been blocked on the basis of outside interpretations of such problematic content. Folklorists who are committed to the nuances of everyday life and oppose grand theories, to put it in Dorothy Noyes' terms, may find further discipline-specific problems with such generalized views because they know that daily realities are full of gray areas. The political views of many liberal-minded Russians expressed publicly may further reinforce the uncomfortable feelings of the Westerners. As Katya Margolis, a pro-Ukrainian Russian activist, critically observes in her Facebook post on April 22, 2023, the anti-war messages delivered by many self-identified Russian liberals are often filled with commentary about universal human values, tolerance, and perception of themselves as equivalent victims of the Putin regime as Ukrainians, ideas that resonate with many in the West. Even though the folklore of anger has been communicated on the internet very widely, I encountered most of it through my own social media accounts. Thus, I had at least some degree of familiarity with many of the individuals performing this folklore. Strikingly, these angry comments often came from those whose views previously would not have been labeled in such black and white terms. War is black and white, though, as Ukrainian anthropologist Tina Pollock argues. Individuals who directly experience brutal physical violence cannot be expected to compromise and seek gray areas. In simple terms, in war-generated life and death situations, there is nothing in between. War is directly linked to the destruction of lives and livelihoods in which even the immediate future is not guaranteed. I was initially editing these lines while witnessing yet another tragedy in Western Ukraine, a region which overall has endured a significantly smaller amount of destruction than have the country's eastern and southern counterparts. A Russian rocket killed an 8-year-old boy who had been playing outside. The rest of his family, who were inside their house, survived, even though the house was destroyed. Everything seemed to have happened in a split second. Wars filled with such numerous accounts of lives destroyed shift realities, producing generalizations with stark contrasts: enemy versus ally, good versus evil. Ukrainian political psychologist Svetlana Chunikhina provides some related insights. I quote, "War is a group phenomenon. A group is not equal to the sum of its members. Other psychological mechanisms and processes are actualized at the group level that do not occur between individuals. The state, the nation, the institutions are at war, not individual people." Closer attention to insider perspectives help to reveal further meanings behind the generalized anti-Russian sentiments. They are especially reflected in another narrative motif, "Всі вони імперіалісти," they are all imperialists, that often accompanies the Ukrainian folklore of anger. The motif indicates that there is a baggage of vernacular historical endurance that seems to be embedded in this phrase. Many Ukrainian responses to the full-scale invasion convey historical realities and traumas that go beyond the current war. Political scientists distinguish among several types of imperialism, including their paths into cyberspace. Time does not allow me to provide a full literature review, so I'll just emphasize the most distinct patterns. So despite its varying implications and trajectories in specific historical and contemporary contexts, the concept of imperialism is most frequently viewed in broad terms of official political discourses, countries, institutions, and their relations. Russian institutional imperialism and its consequences are familiar to most Ukrainians and to many in this audience. The history of Russia's dominance over the territory that is now independent Ukraine is complex and centuries long. The most recent form of Russian oppression occurred during the Soviet era. Similar to their counterparts in other former Soviet republics, generations of Ukrainians, myself included, were raised with the notion that the great Russian language and great Russian culture was superior to Ukrainian. Tragic accounts of the persecution, exile, imprisonment, and murder of Ukrainian cultural and political figures, along with other citizens, by Soviet authorities, Soviet meaning, of course, dominated by Russia, are well documented. And examples include the entire generation of Ukrainian poets, writers, and artists of the 1920s, 1930s, known as the executed Renaissance, the Stalinist repressive period labeled by historians as the Great Terror of the 1936-1938, and the persecution of the dissident artists and intellectuals known as Shizdesyatniki, dissidents of the 60s, who resisted Russification in the 1960s. These accounts are largely unknown in the Western world, where the field of Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies has been dominated by Russian perspectives and narratives of history and culture, representing another dimension of Russian institutional imperialism and its global paths. Lately, there has been a growing tendency to decolonize Slavic and Eastern European studies, or at least to raise awareness of the damaging effects of the dominating Russian imperialist perspectives. Various scholars take different approaches to the task. One distinct effort is reflected in the critical examination of the academic studies of the region that reveal traces of Russian imperialist undertones. For example, focusing specifically on historical narratives, Andrei Zayarnyuk considers a number of North American historians of Eastern Europe to be implicit enablers of the current war, revealing the ways, I quote, they help to create an intellectual framework in which Putin could make his claims about Ukrainian history with a high degree of credibility and expectation of acceptance, end of quote. Similar to Zayarnyuk, Ukrainian anthropologist Yulia Buyskih draws attention to the expertise of Ukrainian scholars when it comes to regional realities. Expanding her critical remarks beyond the area studies, Buyskih addresses the problematic phenomenon of West-splaining, referring to the hierarchies and colonization of academic knowledge more broadly. Western interpretations are often valued and amplified, while their Eastern European counterparts are frequently silenced and marginalized as local and thus biased and unreliable. Medwidsky focuses on several prominent English-speaking anthropologists who have provided explicit commentaries about the Russia-Ukraine war, even though they possess no linguistic or ethnographic expertise of the region. The commentaries include remarks regarding the responsibility of the US and NATO for provoking the full-scale invasion, an idea that is central to Russian propaganda and its imperialist endeavors. As Medwidsky shows, among specific gaps in knowledge on regional realities, such commentaries reveal a broader tendency among some Western scholars to focus exclusively on American imperialism, but their inability to see the damaging and far-reaching effects of its Russian counterparts. In their attempts to decolonize an understanding of Ukrainian culture on a global scale, some scholars, and there are many, I'm just going to give you 3 examples. I'm thinking about historian Olesa Hromeychuk, literary critic Vitaly Chernetsky, and ethnomusicologist Mariya who in both scholarly and popular formats draw attention to the ways Russian imperialist frameworks have historically silenced and misrepresented prominent cultural figures in concert halls, museums, and literary circles. What unites these and numerous other efforts to decolonize regional studies involving Ukraine is their focus on the institutional dimensions of Russian imperialism reflected in the voices of politicians, scholars, and those representing elite and professional cultural expressions such as classical music, visual art, and literature. In order to fully decolonize, we, of course, have to first identify and recognize all patterns of colonization. What I propose to understand as systemic vernacular imperialism is yet another complex dimension of Russian imperialism and its spread. Systemic vernacular imperialism manifests itself vernacularly in daily life, including on the vernacular web, in the words, behaviors, and actions of regular citizens who do not always represent the voices of the top-ranking political players or cultural figures in the international arena. Official imperialist discourses often translate into everyday imaginaries and affect large numbers of people in profound ways. The citizens of politically and culturally dominant countries and regions can sometimes display behaviors, often in expressive ways, that exhibit a vernacular sense of power, control, or entitlement. Systemic vernacular imperialism reveals itself in ways that are not dissimilar to the paths of systemic racism, which I don't have to explain to this audience. It becomes so deeply embedded into everyday life and people's consciousness that it often constitutes part of normalized daily interactions. Recognizing such patterns involves a great degree of self-reflexivity. More specifically, systemic vernacular imperialism provides some further insight into the meanings of the Ukrainian war-generated folklore of anger. More broadly, recognizing its patterns and effects can contribute to the effort of decolonization in daily life, as it is not only institutional discourses, but also vernacular interactions that shape how we think and behave. Systemic vernacular imperialism is not an exclusively Russian phenomenon. An American example comes from my Facebook feed immediately following the 2016 election of Donald Trump as president of the US. Several liberal-minded American Facebook friends posted emotional notes that can be summarized in the following way. I'm fed up with this. I'm moving to Canada. The assumption that this was an easily achievable goal was striking to me as an immigrant to Canada. The immigration process is actually long and complex for many, including the citizens of the US. My Facebook friends wishing to relocate to Canada did not, of course, have any bad intentions. This example simply illustrates that a sense of belonging to what is widely viewed as the most powerful country in the world can translate into vernacular imaginaries, imparted with a sense of entitlement and control over one's life, where everything seems possible. At the time, it was difficult to imagine a single Ukrainian person disappointed with that country's internal political processes, framing their intentions to leave Ukraine in a similar self-empowering way. Russian systemic vernacular imperialism includes contextually specific characteristics. In Russia, the propagandistic ideas of the greatness of Russia and its culture have shaped the consciousness of many Russian citizens, continuously finding ways into multiple spheres of life in vernacular settings. Russian systemic vernacular imperialism becomes especially difficult to recognize when it involves liberal-minded individuals. One example is related to Alexei Navalny. Navalny was an internationally known Russian oppositional leader who had been imprisoned by the Putin regime until February 16, 2024, when official Russian channels proclaimed he had suffered a natural death. His death was seen by many as either a direct or indirect result of Russian government mistreatment. During a 2014 interview with Radio Echo Moskvy, the Echo of Moscow, a journalist asked Navalny, if you become president, will you try to give Crimea back to Ukraine? Navalny responded, is Crimea a sandwich that you can pass back and forth? His response clearly implied that the peninsula would remain part of Russia. So from a Ukrainian perspective, Navalny, whose political platform is seen as democratic and liberal by many in the international community, still reveals imperialist sentiments that go against democratic principles and established international agreements. Reportedly, Navalny eventually changed his views on Crimea. However, his sandwich response remained widely cited by Ukrainians exactly because it communicated the broader issues of systemic vernacular imperialism. Similar to Navalny, many other liberal-minded Russian individuals openly oppose Putin in the war, but simultaneously still display a sense of supremacy over Ukrainians. Importantly, systemic vernacular imperialism is a continuum. Its manifestations can range from explicit and rude to implicit and subtle, from innocent, as in the case of the American example above, to harmful. Vernacular imperialist sentiments can be held unselfconsciously by individuals who mean well. Manifestations of Russian systemic vernacular imperialism may remain unnoticeable to outsiders because these views are not expressed toward them. However, many Ukrainians recognize them immediately. One example of a personal encounter reflecting vernacular systemic imperialism and these related sentiments in the context of daily life dates back to the year of 2007 when I visited St. Petersburg. I was hosted by a liberal-minded and highly educated Russian acquaintance. While sharing with me his impressions of a recent trip to Kiev, the host remarked, "Can you imagine? They teach philosophy in Ukrainian there. They lack words in Ukrainian to teach philosophy. How can they possibly teach philosophy in Ukrainian?" End of quote. My host did not speak any Ukrainian. Nonetheless, he was convinced that the language was insufficient for serious matters. It is unlikely that my Russian host self-consciously intended to insult me. It is more likely that my fluency in Russian created a comfortable space for him to genuinely share his surprises of his recent trip to Kiev. This example illustrates how deeply embedded and normalized systemic vernacular imperialism is in the minds of even some of the most liberal representatives of the Russian society. The idea of the superiority of the Russian language over its Ukrainian counterpart was so deeply ingrained in the consciousness of this individual that he could not even reflect on the potential negative implications of his words at the moment. The next two examples are closely related to the current war, deal with known public figures, and take us into the realm of far-reaching commercial and social media. On March 21st, 2022, less than a month into the full-scale war, Ksenia Sobchak, a Russian journalist and controversial political figure who nonetheless positions herself as a liberal-minded citizen opposed to the Putin regime, interviewed Yevgeny Zharinov, professor of literary criticism at Moscow State University. Professor Zharinov's initial remarks included his non-acceptance of the war. However, their further conversation led by Sobchak evolved around the declining influence of great Russian culture and the Russian language in both Ukraine and Western Europe as a result of the war. The following was one of Sobchak's first questions, I quote, "Let's talk about the Russian language. After the events we are witnessing, its area of circulation will definitely become smaller by at least the whole of Ukraine. How will the Russian language develop now?" End of quote. Essentially, these two influential, liberal-minded Russians, who both opposed the full-scale war, displayed what is deeply ingrained in their consciousness, the Russian imperialist perspective. They were unable to recognize that their worldview automatically and unconsciously included Ukraine as part of the Russian world, nor the detrimental effect that this conversation may have on Ukrainian audiences in light of the ongoing physical destruction. Next is perhaps one of the most scandalous and subtle examples. Yulia Latynina, a well-known Russian dissident journalist and critic of President Putin, while currently residing outside of Russia, wrote the following comment on Twitter. She did it on March 13th, 2022. Because it is very subtle, and I don't want anything to get lost in translation, I'm going to read it in Russian first. Мы наблюдаем возрождение Киевской Руси. Отныне все, что есть в русскоязычном мире, демократического, рыночного и западного, будет сосредоточено в Киеве. Киев снова станет столицей Руси. Москва будет столицей Орды. We're witnessing the revival of Kievan Rus. From now on, everything in the Russian-speaking world that is democratic, market-oriented, and Western will be concentrated in Kiev. Kiev will again become the capital of Rus. Moscow will be the capital of the horde. End of quote. Latynina clearly means to show support for Ukraine and condemns the Russian invasion. However, the implicit connotation of her message is rather problematic from a Ukrainian perspective. In her post, she refers to a particular historical time period. As many in this audience know, Kievan Rus was the first political entity of the Eastern Slavs that existed from the 9th through the 13th centuries. Its territory was located predominantly in what is now Ukraine, but also embraced large parts of today's Belarus and European Russia. It was an important economic, cultural, and political unit in Europe at the time, with its center in the city of Kiev. Orest Subtelny, among other historians, considers the year of 1240 to mark the decline of Kievan Rus, when Kiev fell to the growing Mongol forces. The Mongols, as well as other nomadic invaders who conquered and vassalized the remnants of Kievan Rus, became known as the Golden Horde. Thus, the horde in Latynina's post is a metaphor for pillage and destruction and is symbolically linked to the present-day Russian armed forces led by the Kremlin. As Serhiy Plokhy observes, Kievan Rus as a historical legacy remains a contested matter in scholarly discourses. Serhiy Yakelchik summarizes that Russian historians have viewed it either as the place of origin of the modern Russian state or as that of the, I quote, three fraternal East Slavic peoples, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, end of quote. Such claims were easily possible when Kiev remained part of either the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union dominated by Russia, as Yakelchik argues. However, the declaration of Ukraine's independence in 1991, I quote, presented a direct threat to Russian historical mythology, end of quote, predominantly due to the legacy of the city of Kiev, which was now the capital of independent Ukraine. This also comes from Yakelchik. So Latynina's reference reflects popular imaginaries in Russia, shaped by Russian historical discourses and actually frequently repeated by the Russian president. In such imaginaries, Kievan Rus is largely viewed as what sociologist Anthony Smith would theorize as a golden age of a nation, or rather an empire in this particular case. By referring to Kievan Rus, Latynina emphasizes the Russian imperialist perception of Russians and Ukrainians as one people. In line with her larger imperialist views shaped by her interpretations of history, Latynina assumes that present-day Kiev, as portrayed in her imagined romanticized future, should embrace the Russian language and Russian culture willingly and unproblematically. Thus, Russians do not appear as guests in the Ukraine of her imagined future. Metaphorically speaking, from the point of view of an older sister or older brother, as Russia has historically positioned itself in relation to Ukraine, Russia can enter Ukraine without bothering to knock on the door. Another implication of Latynina's post is rooted not in what she says, but rather what she does not say. It is especially linked to the phrase "we are witnessing." During the third week of the full-scale war, when the tweet was published, many Ukrainians were still shocked by the lack of protests in Russia and the overall relative inertia of the Russian opposition both in Russia and abroad. Latynina's statement is not the call to action that many Ukrainians would have wished to see at the time. She implies that good Russians should just wait until the bad Russians are defeated by the Ukrainians and then enter Ukraine, bringing their Russian culture with them. In other words, while numerous Ukrainians are stripped of their livelihoods and losing their health and lives on the battlefield, Latynina speaks about passive witnessing and waiting for better times. It is needless to say that Latynina's sentiment has received a number of harsh critical reactions in Ukraine, imparted with anger expressed in vernacular ways. For example, Valery Pekar, a Ukrainian entrepreneur and social activist, writes, «А це от з якого біса? Навіщо нам тут російські демократи, ринкові ліберали та західники? Яку додану цінність вони можуть дати українському національному проєкту? Навчити нас, як будувати країну? Хай спочатку побудують свою, демонструвати нам тут комплекс старшого брата?» Why the hell do we need democratic, liberal market and Western-oriented Russians here? What added value can they give to the Ukrainian national project? Teach us how to build a country? Let them build their own first. Do they want to demonstrate their older brother complex here? The above examples go beyond the way imperialism is usually discussed in scholarly literature, namely beyond state and institutional discourses and top-ranking political players and elite cultural expressions. They illustrate the manifestations of what can be understood as systemic vernacular imperialism in daily life, whether in face-to-face interactions or in social media. This partially explains why many Ukrainians no longer consider nuances and complexities and rather express their emotions through the folklore of anger directed toward all Russians. And they do not view the full-scale invasion as simply Putin's war or the Kremlin's war, the way it is still seen by many in the West. This generalization is at least partially informed by numerous encounters of Russian systemic vernacular imperialism, both historical and present day, that outsiders may not always recognize. From a Ukrainian perspective, this mode of thinking in Russia is a big contributing factor to the evolving tragedy, and Ukrainians have to deal with both the brutalities of the current war and the historical baggage that fuels it. Katya Margolis, who harshly criticizes imperialist and overall ignorant and virtue-signaling undertones in the war-related views of many of her good Russian compatriots, remarks in this regard, I quote, "The less someone is involved personally, the louder their talk about objectivity will be, the less it aches and hurts, the easier it is to talk about tolerance," end of quote. Many Ukrainians perform the folklore of anger and violence not because they are inherently intolerant or disrespectful of universal human values and ethical beliefs. They do it because they are trapped in life and death situations and stripped of human values and ethics by their aggressive neighbors. From a Ukrainian perspective, the folklore of anger is a coping mechanism in the context of the black and white war, which in turn evokes extreme responses. Russians, may you all be cursed. Russians, ugly bastards, may you burn in hell. Russians, may you be cursed for 7 generations, are complex human emotions communicated on the vernacular web in a deeply traumatic setting. What I've offered today is a folkloristic analysis of these expressions that take us far beyond their content and far beyond their immediate context. The prism of the folklore of anger helps to reveal complex historical trajectories of systemic vernacular imperialism that fuels present-day Russian atrocities in Ukraine. Unfortunately, I cannot offer any practical ideas on how to fix things. Some decolonization strategies may be relatively easier to implement than others. For example, as reporter Robin Pogrebin describes, due to the activist efforts of Oksana Semeniuk, a Kiev-based art historian, some Western galleries have lately re-identified certain artists and artwork as Ukrainian. Previously, art associated with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union would usually be lumped together as Russian. One of the examples includes a series of the 1899 pastels by Edgar Degas in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. These series were previously labeled as Russian dancers, even though the depicted dancers wear a distinct Ukrainian village attire of the turn of the 20th century. This is an example of an institutional step undertaken under political pressure reinforced by the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As folklorists know very well, though, folkways, including established values and modes of thinking in vernacular settings, do not tend to shift as quickly. Nonetheless, in my opinion, understanding, recognizing, and reflecting upon insider perspectives in the context of everyday life can be a useful step forward, even though those perspectives can be presented indirectly via cultural forms that can make some feel uncomfortable. Thank you.
We're now at a point where I can ask for questions from the floor.
When we look at the evolution of humanity, we see that many countries that had been staunch imperialists, like the British, the French, and Spaniards, who had worldwide empires, somehow they have evolved to a different state, and yet they've maintained most often good relations with their former colonies. Russians seem to be in this permanent state of suspended evolution. Is there anybody working on finding a way to get them to evolve and to become a different people than they have been for centuries?
Many of these efforts that Ukrainian scholars and the scholars of Ukraine and the region more broadly have been making lately within the field of Ukrainian, Slavic, and larger Eastern European studies is one step that scholars can take, right? Because what we do, we produce knowledge, we cover perspectives. It's very important to understand all those kind of multiple angles and multiple perspectives. So I think a lot of work is being done in that regard. What can be done about it in such a way that it would have like a more immediate effect, I don't know. These shifting paradigms in knowledge production processes, they take a long time. Perspectives and especially like imperialist sentiments and attitudes, they don't go away overnight, you know. It takes generations to sort of take it in and reflect upon it.
I have a question about your presentation and specifically about vernacular. Do you think that vernacular that you actually referring in your presentation stopped being vernacular and became also global? Because all of the narratives at this moment, they are present in every society, and they are being circulated, and they live completely in different contexts. So how would you comment on that actually phenomena?
Thank you for that question. It's an important question that my colleague Robert Glenn Howard answered by offering the concept of vernacular web that actually implies like globally circulating ideas on the internet that and get shaped by institutional discourses and grassroots responses to those discourses. So there's no doubt that these are global phenomena, right? And vernacular web implies that there's an institutional component in that as well very often. Yes, and they cross geographical borders and even linguistic boundaries because things get translated, auto-translated online these days. So you're absolutely right. When we talk vernacular, we understand. So I cited Navalny. It's a kind of an important political voice in Russia. It's a political leader, right? But it sort of feeds into this broader concept of systemic vernacular imperialism that speaks to many of his followers, even though they may self-identify as liberal individuals. It's very complex and messy.
I had a question on something that you mentioned in your lecture, is that for a lot of Western viewers, these messages seem like hate speech. Mm-hmm. And I heard it many times here in Canada that a lot of Ukrainians are mean because we as Ukrainian citizens right now are wishing deaths to ordinary Russians. What would be your suggestion as to how to better explain to those people who are not maybe completely involved in the Ukrainian context, what are the differences between the hate speech traditionally and what we see in those messages that are posted online by Ukrainians? Thank you.
What a complex and important question. I wish I had an easy answer to it. Theoretical frameworks, including particular concepts and definitions that are developed in the context of relative peace, cannot fully explain the situations of war. You know, it's really black and white, and I think that getting that message across is a step forward. Of course, like from our North American perspective here, where niceness, tolerance, positivity are considered to be, social and cultural virtues, like facing those angry comments, it can make us shiver, right? But what folklorists do well, what anthropologists have been doing well, is contextualizing things and contextualizing them not from the perspectives of the observers and onlookers, but from the perspectives of those who perform that kind of folklore, right? So I think this is as much as we can do as scholars, just explain. And this is exactly what I tried to do in this lecture. Ukrainians are not immoral monsters who don't adhere to universal human moral values. They are put in the situation of extreme precarity that is not comprehensible from, the perspective of relative peace and niceness. So we should be talking about it and contextualizing it. Again, this is what we can do as scholars, I think.
Mariya, my question is geared towards more of a historical perspective. You provided a number of interesting examples of how people feel immediately today in this one situation. Has anyone looked at and compared situation in Ukraine with, say, Belgium in World War I, or France in World War I, World War II, Holland in World War II, England in World War II, whether the anger that's being expressed today is directly related or comparable to people who've suffered from occupation, or if we flip it to another part of the world, the Philippines, or the Japanese occupation of China, or wherever else. Has anyone done that sort of comparison to be able to say, well, this is not an isolated example, but it connects to all these others that have happened over the centuries of war and conflict?
What a great and complex question. Thank you. I am not aware of such comparative studies, especially those that would be dealing with anger, but I'm going to look into it. It's very, very interesting and important. What resonates with me, what you mentioned, these are not unique examples. I remember, again, as an ethnographer, I pay attention to daily realities, and now I remember my grandfather in Ukraine making, problematic comments about certain colonial forces that he experienced during his youth and childhood in Ukraine. And I remember shivering, while hearing those. But now, through the prism of this war that we are all witnessing more directly, I can sort of understand and contextualize those sentiments that I didn't take quite well at the time, because it was so historically distant to me what he experienced as a young person. So just based on those examples alone, I am totally positive that this is not a unique phenomenon. It's not only about Ukraine, that it's pretty universal.
Just as a follow-up, what you've just said is, fortunately, my parents interviewed their parents, and I've got probably a dozen 12, 15 hours of tape. And I think I'm going to have to now go back and listen to examples just like you've touched on. Because I remember in one of them, my grandfather describes their occupation of their village in Poltavshchina and stuff. It'll be interesting to see how it compares to the expressions that are coming out now.
And also what adds another layer of complexity to that, describing something retrospectively as opposed to reacting to it happening in real time, especially when it comes to intense emotions such as anger.
Coming back to the notion of imperialism, and in particular vernacular imperialism, I'm always tempted in these times as ours, as you've pointed out, they're trying times. We are on a very sharp trajectory going down or up into some sort of theoretical domain of decolonization, trying to address it all. But looking back in particular at Ukrainian situation, imperialism has a home. First of all, it had a home in the Russian imperial period. Then it had a home in the Soviet legacy. For a while, we've been engaged with the notion of post-socialism, post-Sovietness to address similar topics. This is just a comment, it's not necessarily a question. And it reminds me of the times when we travel the world and we find matryoshkas all wearing Ukrainian embroideries as a pure example of that takeover from whatever period of time, wherever it would be placed. I'd give it home of a Soviet period, but maybe I'm wrong. What I'm following here in the sense of responding to your presentation is this particular path of mine is a bit more complicated, because I'm stumbled in this home of Sovietness when it comes down to Soviet imperialism, and then it comes down to the breakdown and the full-scale invasion and what we have seen. I feel that we're in an absolutely different zone when it comes down to culture, vernacular responses. And I'll give you an example of what I guess I'm trying to formulate here. Many of us are following the various social media sources. For example, when sirens go in Ukraine, I have my preferred channels. I go and see reports outlining where it comes from a particular relied source. And then there's another channel which offers comments to this particular individual who is announcing that. That sort of a channel fascinates me the most, because in a second of a time, there are 15,000 responses being uploaded. And when the sirens are blowing and the buildings are falling down and it's responding to the hatred which Ukrainians seem to be generating, those are exactly the moments in time when hatred is generated. So you have these thousands upon thousands responses from all over Ukraine, all over people in Ukraine and elsewhere, expressing their anger in all direct and very vernacular and folkloric ways. I'm sure you've done that too. Mm-hmm. You followed those ones. So coming back to this idea of imperialism and its collapse, which of course we're experiencing that, I wonder if this is the preoccupation of Ukrainians right now. They're not dealing immediately with imperialism or vernacular imperialism. They're dealing exactly with these cultural formations which are part of that liminal space of broken down, alter, anti-structure, which Victor Turner had long explained and described to us. So, and that was my question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, these are important remarks. There are so many layers to this. There's so much. How we talk about imperialism intellectually, how we talk about like forms of imperialism and its paths, how it's perceived vernacularly. What you're saying, it's all true. People are angry in that particular moment, right? When you kind of watch like rocket flying over your hometown, you do not think about imperialism, you're thinking about your immediate safety, right? What I was trying to think about is how it's all complex, and how vernacular knowledge is shaped by so many sources of information, including personal experiences, right? Again, I can think of like older generations of Ukrainians being angry in the moment and expressing very general angry remarks, sort of hinting at that historical trajectory of Russian imperialism. So I guess it's so many things, right? There is like an intellectual dimension to all of it. There is like an experiential dimension, and it's so complex in that very moment, right? But what we do as folklorists and anthropologists, we try to unpack some of these complexities.
I'm really fascinated by the way how you complicate this black and white feeling and expression with this very much nuanced call to look at vernacular systemic imperialism. My question is, Ukrainians and Ukrainian scholarship at the same time is somehow in between the rock and a hard place. So on one hand, it's Russian imperialism, and the other hand is this West-splaining that Yulia Buisky is talking about so explicitly. And what you do is fighting this, is actually trying to turn it upside down and get people to listen and understand. I'm really looking forward to hearing what scholarly conversation happens after your article comes out and your colleagues. I mean, if it's even in the scholarship that people don't see or see it as black and white, as all Russians, or like what else can we do as scholars, as academics, to make it more nuanced, more complex as it is in real life, and make people listen and hear?
Thank you. I cite Mariya Sonevitska, and Lesiv does work in that area too, using popular formats, not necessarily academic articles, is one of the ways that some scholars have been trying to communicate these colonization, decolonization ideas. So Mariya Sonevitsky's article was actually published in the program to Evgeny Onegin. So it was not an academic article in which she unpacks what you're about to see, kind of unpacks it from a Ukrainian perspective. So I find these popular formats that reach wider audiences to be effective, and perhaps sometimes more effective than journal articles that often end up collecting dusts on library shelves. So this is one thing that I can think about.
Could it be that Ukrainians are more genetically inclined to be Democrats than Russians? And the reason I ask that is, one, we ourselves say Bratya Kozatskoho Rodu in our national anthem. Gorbachev, his mother was Ukrainian, and he was one of the leading Democrats in the post-Soviet era. Navalny's father was Ukrainian, and Navalny spent summers in Ukraine with his grandmother, where he actually learned to speak Ukrainian. Is there perhaps genetic difference between us that we are more inclined to be rebels and not to succumb to tyranny than Russians?
Unfortunately, I'm definitely not professionally equipped to talk about genetics. That's one thing that I cannot reflect on. As a folklorist, I can talk about like layers of socio-political, cultural, historical experiences that people go through that shape who they are and how they think. But the genetic part I cannot, unfortunately, address.
I'm so appreciative of it and also of the context in which you present and try to make intelligible to us pain, rage, and things that, speaking as someone who lives in Canada and is an American-Canadian mix, I'll say niceness is such a dead-on stereotype that resonates in its truths. And thank you for bringing it up. One of the things you've done very courageously is to confront anger in this Canadian context, this Ukrainian-Canadian context. What you've done is opened up something where Canadians who are not familiar with the situation, despite everything in the media, despite everything, books that should be opened and people who should be listened to, what it does is it lets people who don't want to hear harsh words recognize themselves in terms of veering away from those things. When it comes to Black Lives Matter, when it comes to so many aspects of sort of a, let's not talk about what the priests did in residential school. There's a niceness here that is very difficult to penetrate without taking things to a point where they are removed from real lived experience, but by keeping that context, you've provided a way in for Canadians to listen. I'm just extremely appreciative of it and also of the comments in this collective community in the spirit of your dear beloved late professors. This is truly a credit to what you're trying to achieve here in that spirit. So thank you so much to you and to the organizers for putting this together.
Andy, thank you for providing that. Comments to end this afternoon's talk, Mariya. We were very grateful for you coming. Grateful to everyone for joining us. Дякую.